I'm going to start with some background. So the whole thing started with Aristotle. And what you see on your screen now is a modern representation of Aristotle's table of categories. And I regard an ontology, and certainly an ontology like BFO, as being very much in the spirit of Aristotle's table of categories. There are some things which Aristotle gets wrong, some things which are missing, but on the whole, he does a pretty good job in representing what we need. And the first approximation to specifying what we need is we need a way of understanding all the different kinds of entities which make up ordinary, everyday, common sense reality, where this reality will include some parts of biology, some parts of chemistry, some parts of sociology, some parts of meteorology, and so on. My own introduction to ontology came when I was still in what in America and in England now is called high school. My teachers there realized that I had an interest in philosophy, and so they thought that I should read some philosophy. And the first book I read was Russell on the philosophy of mathematics. The second book I read, which I guess was the first book that really changed my life, was Wittgenstein's Tractatus. If you start with Aristotle, Aristotle had a table of categories. He didn't have axioms, which means he didn't have logic in the sense that we have logic today. And so I want to start by considering the connection between BFO and the applied ontology which we are creating around BFO. On the one hand, thinks that ontology is a part of logic. And I believe that logical tools are indispensable to doing ontology, that everything that we do in ontology is going to depend upon the use of logical tools, which include logical definitions, logical software, logical languages, and so on. But there's more to ontology than just logic. And what there is in the early history of BFO was defined by Husserl. Probably the greatest contribution to ontological philosophy in the 20th century is the logical investigations. In this work, he distinguishes between formal logic on the one hand and formal ontology on the other hand. And for Husserl, formal ontology is about the formal relations between entities in reality. And for him, reality is just this mesoscopic reality that I was referring to earlier. So we have, on the one hand, formal logic, which deals with the relations between propositions, axioms, definitions, and so forth. And it deals with truth. And on the other hand, we have formal ontology, which deals with the relations between things. So logic deals with the relations between propositions. Ontology deals with the relations between things. There is formal logic, which deals with the relations between truths at a very high level of generality, where no specific kinds of propositions, for instance, biological propositions or propositions about music or propositions about death are at issue, but rather very general relations among propositions like implication, contradiction, and so on. And similarly, formal ontology deals with very general relations between the types of entities in reality. So formal for Husserl doesn't mean symbolic as it does in in the work of many people in the 20th century who work on logic. Formal means domain neutral. So what we're doing in formal ontology is we are capturing the domain neutral relations between the different types of entities in reality. And Husserl identified the two most important types. They are the two most important relations, which are dependence relations on the one hand, and part-whole relations on the other hand. And the fourth logical investigation is the first contribution to formal ontology in the sense I just defined. And it talks precisely about dependence relations and part-whole relations as part of a single methodology. And now, Husserl's greatest student was a Polish philosopher called Roman Ingarden. In fact, it was this work, which is an English translation of Ingarden's main work, namely Time and Modes of Being, which introduced me to ontology. It's a contribution to formal ontology in the very general sense. And two of the terms that we use in work on BFO are generically dependent continuant and concretization. And both of these terms were introduced by Ingarden. So Ingarden played almost equal a role in the early history of BFO as did Husserl. And now I'm going to give John the opportunity to agree with me.
Yeah, I actually don't think we're disagreeing. But I think I recall why you might think that I think that ontology is part of logic. So I did give a talk once where I was talking about what ontologists do, and I pitched it to an audience that is unfamiliar with logic and formalisms as capturing something like the logic of the world, which was entirely for marketing.
Okay, good.
It's more or less like I agree with what you're saying. I with one caveat. So um, the talk of logic as being restricted to relationships between truths. I think logic is broader than that because I think there are entailments that don't have to do with truth, like prescriptions in arguments.
Good.
But the broader notion of designated value that captures like what I would call logical consequence between propositions or prescriptions, however you want to cash out the machinery, I think is like as long as that's the only caveat. It's just bigger than
Okay.
truth, designated value. But otherwise, everything you've said on the ontology and logic distinction, 100% agree with it. I would cash this more carefully out, or what we do more carefully out as we are, ultimately aiming to describe some fundamental, when we're talking about BFO, or formal structure of the world.
Good. So that caveat is actually quite interesting. Husserl himself, like nearly every philosopher since Aristotle, thought that there was only one way of understanding sentences, namely, sentences are expressions of truths, or if you're unlucky, they are falsehoods. Now, we know since at least about 1913 that we can use sentences or use language in all kinds of ways. For instance, we can use it prescriptively,
Mhm.
or to make promises, or to make plans, or to make threats, and so on. And so it's not clear that all of that belongs to logic, but it is clear that our concern with logic has to extend to include those other things, and of course it does. One of Husserl's followers, a man called Johannes Daubert, who didn't publish anything in his life, but he was very influential among the school to which Ingarden belonged. He was the first person to question Husserl about this thesis that propositions are in the business, or sentences rather, are in the business of asserting truths exclusively. For Daubert, there were questions, for instance, and there were negations, denials, and suggestions and assumptions and so forth, which were expressed using sentences. All right, so I will now move on to the next. These are all things that happened in real time to me. In 1993, I discovered that there was a group of engineers, actually. They called themselves engineers, who were working in Italy on something called Dolce, the domain ontology for linguistic and cognitive engineering. And I was immediately attracted by Dolce, but it turned out that they had already read some of the work I had been doing in a philosophical context on ontology. And so we came into contact with each other. I visited the Dolce group in Padua in 1993, and the BFO grew in part out of that. It wasn't a collaboration so much as an opportunity to gain suggestions going in both directions. So one of the things which the leader of this group in Padua has asserted is that where he started off as an engineer, and his institute was part of an engineering institute in Padua, I taught him that he should really be doing philosophy. And I would say that if he taught me anything, that it was that philosophers should start doing engineering. But in any case, this is what the Dolce taxonomy looks like. And it's stayed the same for 28 years now. The axioms governing this ontology have stayed the same for 28 years now, which is a good thing because it means people know at every stage what's what in the Dolce ontology, but it's not such a good thing if people find mistakes or if the technology changes so that we need to do things slightly differently. Now, I think that if you look at it carefully and if you know about BFO, you will see that there are lots of similarities. The naming is different. So we talk about continuance and occurrence. Dolce talks about endurance and perdurance. But otherwise, there's very much a common connection. And there's even a common connection going back all the way to Aristotle. However, there were things wrong with Dolce. One of the things wrong had to do with their documentation, which was written by Italians. Now, they were writing in English, but the English was not everything that one would desire when it comes to precision. Moreover, it was peppered with chunks of formalism like this. And nearly all the documentation of Dolce contains sections which look like this. I think that one of the reasons why Dolce has had such, how can I put this, has had little enduring influence is that people find it very difficult to work with these kinds of abbreviations. And BFO does not use abbreviations like pre and o and so forth. It uses words, singular nouns and noun phrases. And I think this is an important distinction because it's very hard to convince somebody who is not an expert in first order logic, which is what this is, to take Dolce seriously. All right, now, 5 years later, I became involved with a group of people in the university at Buffalo who were working on actually creating the new discipline of geographic information science. Buffalo was one of the 3 universities which created this new science. And I learned a lot from working with the GIS people. I was basically trying to develop the ontology of geography, using them as a springboard. So for instance, what is the correct ontological description of a mountain? And one of the insights which occurred to me during this work was that an ontology is very similar to a map legend. So a map legend contains singular nouns which refer to types of entities, and those types of entities are then instantiated at specific points in space, which are represented by corresponding icons on maps. Now, we don't use icons much in ontology, but we use all of those other things The maps are databases. The icons are column headers in those databases. And the legend is the ontology, which tells us how we are to understand the column headers in the database. I'm simplifying somewhat, but you get the idea. And so there were two people who were inspiring me and collaborating with me in this GIS work. One of them was David Mark, who is one of the three founders of the entire discipline. The other was Pierre Grenon, who is a Frenchman, as you can see. And Pierre and I wrote the first papers on BFO, or on what came to be called BFO. And he came from the GIS world, but not in Buffalo. He came from the GIS world as it existed around a school of thought or an initiative called Psych, which is short for encyclopedia. And Pierre worked on this Psych project until I hired him to work for me at the institute I had founded in Germany. All right, now there are two important contributions in addition to this idea of legends, two important terminological contributions that came from GIS and then were adopted in BFO. One of them is the idea of a fiat boundary. So many of the boundaries here, this is Thomas Jefferson's map of the original 15 colonies, together with the additional states which Jefferson named. And most of his names, in one form or another, actually survived. And you'll see that we have here geospatial entities which are separated from each other by straight lines. Those straight lines are what we call fiat boundaries. And they are contrasted with those boundaries which are separated by, for instance, rivers or coastlines, which are what we call bona fide boundaries. Now, this idea of fiat boundary is now which was introduced by me in this work with GIS people, is now a quite common term, not just in GIS, but it's used in other disciplines also. But it became part of the worldview that we were developing over the years since then in creating BFO. The second idea which came from the GIS work is the idea of a site or a place. A site is it can be bounded by a fiat boundary, or it can be bounded by a bona fide boundary. So England, well, no, that's not right. England is bounded both by fiat boundaries and by bona fide boundaries, such as the coastline. There's a fiat boundary separating England from Wales and separating England from Scotland. But islands in the sea, island nations have bona fide boundaries. And what a bona fide boundary is a certain type of physical discontinuity. All right, now, I think this is the final contribution to the beginnings of BFO that I want to talk about. I mentioned already an institute which I founded in Germany, to which Pierre Grenon was hired, and along with other now quite important names in the history of applied ontology. This institute was dedicated to the ontology of medicine. It was the first institute to use ontology, to develop ontology for biomedical research. And very early on, I discovered that there was already an existing biomedical ontology called a gene ontology, which is an ontology of the attributes of gene products like proteins. So what they do, where they're found, and how they influence biological phenomena downstream. Those are the three parts of the gene ontology. I discovered that the gene ontology was going to be important to me for the rest of my life because I had this new institute. I didn't know that there was any work in biomedical ontology when I founded it. I was naive in all respects. I discovered the gene ontology and saw that this is exactly what was needed, and it was already being used by a lot of people. And it was an ontology in the sense that I understood it. So all of these were good things. But the problem was that the people who were building it didn't know about logic. And so they insisted that all the terms in the gene ontology should have a definition, but they didn't understand how to write definitions. And I wrote papers, the samizdat papers at that time, about these problems. And my institute then invited the leadership of the gene ontology to come to Leipzig, which is where we were based, for a meeting on the formal architecture of the gene ontology. And I became then very much involved with the gene ontology. I was one of their advisory board. I was communicating with all the principals. They were taking my suggestions seriously, and they learned how to write well-formed definitions. They still are not, well, I won't say any more than that. Now, at the same time, because of the success of the gene ontology, and you have to remember that this was the time of the Human Genome Project when every university around the world was trying to set up repositories of genomics and proteomics and other kinds of omics data, and they were all doing it in different ways. And the gene ontology was built to solve the problem of silos, which was caused by this rapid development of separate repositories of omics data. And that was why it was successful, because everybody recognized that it served the purpose of linking all of these different repositories with a single, well-curated ontology of important features of genes and proteins, basically. And that means other people started building ontologies because genes and proteins are not everything. There are also diseases, and there are RNA molecules, and there are anatomical structures, and there are populations, and so forth. And so there are infections, and there are organs. And so people started building ontologies of these other things, and they all did it differently. And I was there in the very center of this activity with a lot of influence through the collaboration with the gene ontology leadership. And so with their contributions and with a lot of feedback going in both directions, we built something called the Obo Foundry, which is an initiative of ontologists who are building ontologies for different but related domains, but doing this in such a way that the ontologies are consistent with each other. And so these are the ontologies. The three parts of the gene ontology are the cellular component in the middle, the molecular function to the right and down at the bottom, and the biological process, which is well, actually, it's nowadays all three of the things in the right-hand column. There is some terminological development on that front, but initially it was just called biological process. So three gene ontologies, and then everything else here represents new ontologies, or at least new targets for ontology building, most of which have been realized in one way or another, not all of them in the precise way in which I had wanted them to be built when I created this diagram. Now, the diagram has two dimensions, the horizontal and the vertical. The vertical dimension concerns granularity. So the small stuff goes at the bottom and the bigger stuff goes at the top. The gene ontology at that time was interested only in the two bottom lines. They were not interested in big stuff. And, um, and the second dimension is the horizontal dimension. And this is dividing the world into continuance on the one hand and occurrence on the other hand, and dividing the continuance on the one hand into independent continuance like people and planets and tennis balls, and on the other hand, dependent continuance such as functions and qualities and attributes in general and capabilities. And then there are occurrence, which are really just processes. Now, this is BFO. So BFO was created on the basis of all of the things I just mentioned, Aristotle, Husserl, Ingarden, Guarino, but it was created with this architecture as its top level. This is where BFO starts. Everything we say from this slide now is going to be about continuance and occurrence and about independent continuance and dependent continuance. All right, now the Obo Foundry was successful, amazingly successful. It goes on from strength to strength, doesn't get everything right, but it keeps on getting things right, and it keeps on being used by more and more people in the biomedical ontology world to create ontologies which satisfy this rule more or less well, namely that ontologies which cover neighboring domains should be consistent with each other in such a way that we avoid silos. And now a summary of that methodology is to say that they follow the hub and spokes approach. The hub is BFO, and the first level of spokes are the ontologies whose terms are defined using BFO. And then the second level of spokes are ontologies defined using terms from the first level of spokes, and so on until you get down to very, very low levels of ontologies with very large numbers of distinctions being drawn, as is the case for the ontologies within the Obo Foundry today. So the first way in which we grew was in the granularity direction. We added ontologies for larger things like populations, communities, families, species in principle. And then the second way in which we grew, and this shows how BFO was gradually working its way into the sinews of biomedical research, we invented the environment ontology. Now, the environment ontology covers all levels of granularity because populations have environments, single organisms have environments, cells have environments. That's important for tumor formation, for instance, in cancer. And molecules have environments, so inside cells, for instance. And so the environment ontology is a very broad-ranging ontology, and it's an ontology about different kinds of sites, sites in the BFO terminology. And these sites range from on the back of a peanut butter sandwich where salmonella bacteria have established themselves to in the air above a field of dead animals, which is the environment of a buzzard or of any kind of dead animal eating bird. All right, so the next big step. So BFO remained the same from the very beginning until this next step. And I think this next step occurred quite early on. And everything I've talked about so far is about the world, bacteria, buzzards, fields. And the next step was we learned that we had to talk about knowledge of the world. We had to build an ontology of knowledge. And the reason was the following. So when you're describing your data in a paper, a biomedical paper to be published in a biomedical journal, funded by a biomedical grant, you have to describe what you did, not just what parts of the world you studied. The disease and the bacteria which cause the disease are really important, but how you identified the bacteria, that's important too. And that's not part of the world. It's part of your behavior as a scientist. And so the Obo Foundry needed a way of dealing with what scientists do when they carry out research. So for those of you who are philosophers, this is inventing the philosophy of science, but doing it in a proper ontological way. And this is actually, from the point of view of the quality of the engineering of the ontology, probably the most impressive part of the Obo Foundry. So it was called OBI, which is the Ontology for Biomedical Investigations. I've named it. I'm responsible for naming a number of important things, just because I was in the right place at the right time. But I now realize that I named it wrongly. I realized this years ago, but I couldn't change it. So it's wrong because a good fraction of the terms in OB apply to any kind of experiment, not just to biomedical experiments. It refers to it works. It's used in describing chemical experiments or sociological experiments even. And any kind of experiment is going to use the terms in OB. And so OB should really have been called OE or EA, the experiment ontology. And some people have built experiment ontologies, but because they're not fitting themselves into a framework like this, they make mistakes, or anyway, they do things which contribute to silo formation, which is what we should always be aiming to avoid. If I had been starting again, I would have called it the experiment ontology. Now, a lot of the data that we have using OB is, for obvious reasons, data about biomedical experiments or biological experiments and chemical experiments, because most of the interesting work in chemistry that used ontology at that time was in the field of organic chemistry. All right, but now there's another step. And so the first step led to the first step here led to no real change in BFO, but this step led to a big change in BFO. This step is the move from realism about knowledge, about the practices of scientists and so forth, to realism about the information artifacts that scientists use and create. And we have to thank Alan Ruttenberg. This is a really bad picture. For this vital move. He was already involved in a big way in the industrial use of biomedical ontologies, and he became influential in not merely in proselytizing on behalf of BFO, but also in helping to shape it and to appropriately slow down its methods in such a way that we maximally avoid mistakes. So he was in no small part responsible for the creation of what we call the information artifact ontology. I think this is a correctly named ontology. So other people have built information ontologies. And one rule of BFO or of applied ontology as we try to practice it is that the terms which we use when building ontologies should be singular nouns or singular noun phrases. An example of a noun phrase would be information artifact. And another example would be cellular function. If you look at the gene ontology, there are singular noun phrases which have literally dozens of words in them. They're very long phrases. Now, actually, the rule is every term in an ontology should be a singular noun or noun phrase that is not a mass noun. It's a count noun. A mass noun is something like luggage. You recognize a mass noun by the fact that you can't make a plural of it. So you can't say luggages. You can't say informations. You can't say sugars or waters or stones. Or maybe you can say stones. Ignore that. So sugar, luggage, information are all mass nouns. In practicing ontology building, and by now we had a good 5 years of experience, we found that whenever you use mass nouns, you make mistakes. And the reason is that there's no real unique thing that sugar refers to. Does it refer to the sugar in this bowl? Does it refer to all the sugar in the universe? Does it refer to the chemical substance, whatever that means, sugar? So different people are going to use the word sugar in their ontologies in different ways, and that will lead to errors, which it did lead to. Errors which apply, for instance, to a word like cancer. Cancers is sort of usable. It has its use, but it causes problems, as we will see later on. Cancer can mean different things and does mean different things in different ontologies. And when you put those ontologies together, and when you see what happens to the associated data, then you get problems. Another one is blood. Blood is a very interesting mass noun. So avoid mass nouns. That's rule number 72 in good ontology practice. Always say portion of blood, or invent something like the substance blood, or a portion of blood of type such and such. You never use a mass noun when building an ontology. All right, so that's why we called it the information artifact ontology, because we wanted to avoid using mass nouns. And we didn't want to talk about information because that would have created just the same kinds of problems as are caused by sugar and blood. But there's another reason. At this time, which is about 2005, there was a big fashion to suggest that all of biology is a matter of information, that proteins are information, genes are information. And so we can do biology using computers. People have stopped believing that now, but there are still traces of it in naive beliefs that we can create mechanical brains, for instance, which would be exact replicas of human brains, biological brains. In those days, people really did believe that proteins were information. Alan and I didn't believe this because proteins are molecules, damn it. And what we know about proteins now tells us that the information about proteins is not at all in a one-to-one relation connected to the proteins as molecular phenomena. That the molecular level and the information level have to be separated ontologically if you want to do a good ontological job. And so we created the information artifact ontology in order to avoid people thinking that proteins, different types of proteins, could be classified under the information ontology. Proteins are not artifacts. Artifacts are sentences or databases or full stops or funding proposals and so forth. And so publications, images, algorithms, engineering models, simulations, designs, all of these are information artifacts. Work on the information artifact ontology is moving too slow because there are so many ways in which the realm of information artifacts are becoming ever more important to the concerns of human beings. All right, this is BFO 2020. And well, you can see at the top we have continuance versus occurrence. Entity is just a gimmick to hold everything together. We have three types of continuance: independent continuance, which are people, planets, tennis balls; generically dependent continuance, which are things like sentences or word. Let's say word, that's a good example. So the word tennis ball, let the phrase tennis ball, it's a singular noun phrase, is the same singular noun phrase whether I use it or you use it, and whether I use it today or you use it tomorrow. It's not dependent upon any of our uses, but it is dependent on some uses. If no one used to use the words tennis ball, there wouldn't be the words tennis ball. And so tennis ball, that noun phrase, is generically dependent upon uses. It's not specifically dependent on uses. Most of the attributes that we deal with, such as weight, mass, color, temperature, and so on, and so pain, are specifically dependent continuants. That is to say, they inhere in only one bearer. So your height inheres in just you, only you have it. Your temperature inheres in just you, only you have it. And then we have occurrence, which are really just processes. There are also process boundaries, so the beginning of a race or the end of a race. Then we have temporal regions, which are also occurrence in the BFO approach. And then we have spatiotemporal regions, which are also occurrence in the BFO approach. This was the version which we created 5 years ago in 2020. It's the version which was submitted to the ISO standards process, but that process led to some minor changes leading to, actually, no, this is the result of the minor changes which the ISO standardization process led to. There have been more foundries built. The most important for a long time was the Industrial Ontologies Foundry, which it deals with things like industrial design, manufacturing, and so forth. And they use BFO as a hub. This is an example of an IOF ontology. It's a maintenance ontology, and BFO is the top level ontology for the IOF, just as it's the top level ontology for the OBO Foundry. And this is the ISO standard for being a top level ontology. And as you can see, it costs 0 Swiss francs. So run while you can. And then this is part 2 of the ISO standard, which is the basic formal ontology documentation and the demonstration that BFO satisfies the rules for being a top-level ontology formulated in part 1, which you see is called requirements. And this is also costing you 0 Swiss francs. It's post-free. And so now, I guess I have 10 minutes. So I will do some part of the reasoning behind what it means to call BFO a realist ontology. Now, I think it's still true that computer scientists are not, I'm going to be very controversial now. Computer scientists and the developers of databases uh, are not really interested in reality. They're, and quite rightly, given their place in life, they're interested in writing software which executes. And reality is often complicated and it often makes difficulties for the people who write software that executes because it's full of complications. And so in the early days of biomedical informatics, people built ontology related software for biomedicine and they deliberately simplified what was known about the reality. So they created simplified models in order to describe or document the data that was being collected. And those models then were distorting the data. And I know this because I had lots of conversations with the people who were doing it. And they thought I was crazy because I thought that the best way to deal with data is to take account of what it is in the world that the data are about. So I don't know how it is now. I don't talk to computer scientists quite so much as I used to do, with strangely. Maybe they've all given up hope that I will say anything that they can agree with. But anyway, this is the basis of BFO realism. We're going to deal with data in such a way as to take account of what it is in the world that the data are about, where what it is in the world includes knowledge about the data. It includes what the data are about, but also knowledge about what the data are about. That's part of the world too. And also information about the knowledge about the data in the world is going to be in the world too. So we're not leaving anything out. And this is true of software models. The best way to deal with a software model, so for instance, a large language model, is to take account of what it is in the world that the model is about. Now, of course, that's problematic because large language models are not about anything, but that's a problem for another day. So whatever it is that they're about, there's only one thing it can be, namely everything that exists, which is if we can't make it work for this, then we're not going to be able to make it work for anything. Everything, that's what exists, that's what BFO is about. And that's what all the domain ontologies using BFO as hub should be about. And then there are various problems here. There are future things, which we will deal with in a minute. There are mistaken beliefs, which seem to be about something. There are fictions. All of these things have been dealt with in the literature around BFO. Some of them are still being dealt with, and we're making progress. But the core is that when you build an ontology, you should find the domain in reality which your ontology will be about. Now, we've already seen that there are multiple granular perspectives. So we can deal with you either as an aggregate of molecules or as an aggregate of cells or as an aggregate of organs and portions of tissue, including carcinomatous portions of tissue, if you're unlucky. And so that's what we saw earlier on when we were dealing with the granularity dimension of BFO. So BFO allows multiple perspectives. It's not trying to confine people who do ontology to any single view of the world. It embraces multiple views of the world. So we can also treat you as part of a larger population or as having a separateness from other things in its surroundings called your skin, basically. So this is the granularity level. But now BFO is a realist ontology also in regard to other kinds of perspectives. So we can take a perspective which views only the things in the world, only the objects, only the continuance, in other words. This is what a warehouse manager deals with when the warehouse manager is interested in the stocks in the warehouse. But then there is someone else in the factory that's dealing with the flows, which are the processes of goods through the warehouse. And both of those perspectives are equally important, and both of them have their own kinds of data. And so you could, in principle, use BFO and only deal with a current terminology. Or you can use BFO and only deal with continuant terminology. Both of those would still be perfectly conformant to the BFO approach. And just as we can view the objects we're interested in using different granularities. So these are the continuant terms in the, or continuant ontologies in the Obo Foundry, and these are the occurrent ontologies. And now we make this claim. Everything in the universe is either a continuant or an occurrent. Now, BFO has enemies. And one of the biggest enemies, and he and I have a long-standing hate-love relationship, so there's plenty of love there. He claims that you should never make claims like this because things change and you get messy things. And if you want to deal with the mess, then you should avoid making claims. I'm simplifying now, but he says more or less things like that. And now he would say, well, what is a flame then? Is it a continuant or an occurrent? He would say it's something somewhere in the middle because it has continuant features and occurrent features. And we would say that a flame is a continuant, a forest fire is a continuant, an ocean wave is a continuant, Christianity is a continuant. Now, why do we say that all of those things? Because we define a continuant as anything which exists as the same identical thing through time. So if a forest fire starts in a certain point in the forest and spreads through the forest, it's the same forest fire, so it's a continuant. If a pack of monkeys starts to follow the forest fire and jump from tree to tree to keep up with the forest fire, then in exactly the same sense, the pack of monkeys is a continuant. In fact, it goes under the population ontology that I referred to earlier. And similarly with ocean waves and similarly with Christianity, they all continue to exist through time identically. Now, of course, they change. They get bigger or smaller, but you changed. You are now much bigger than you were when you were born, but you're still the same continuant. All right, so now the next big thing, and I'm going to overrun. Bill can stop me if I'm doing something wrong. So the next big thing is dealing with universals. So ontologies are not databases. They're not textbooks. They're not maps, because they are legends of maps. Their focus is much smaller than the focus of the map maker or the data gatherer. Ontologies are representations of universals, of those universals which have instances in reality, and of the relations between those universals. And I'm going to use the word universal in a way which makes it equivalent in meaning to all of these other words. We need to do more work on this terminological issue, but it doesn't matter for anything that we do here. And we have been doing some new work, so this has not been blessed. Certainly not. It's much too new. So all right. So we are working with the idea that there are two kinds of universals, which we're going to call free universals and bound universals. This will probably never be part of BFO, but it will be in the background for certain purposes having to do with understanding things like physics and mathematics from an ontological point of view. So free universals are completely free. They hold on Mars, they hold on distant galaxies. In principle, they can hold. And the categories in Aristotle's table of categories are all free universals. And they include things like the universal object, which has instances such as Alan Ruttenberg, the universal BFO calls process, and so on. And then other free universals would be organism, color, temperature. And then bound universals would be tied to a certain culture or planet or engineering factory. And they made, so this is very uncertain. Now, it would definitely include Ford Pinto. It will definitely include pizza. I'm ignoring frog deliberately. It will definitely include Homburg hat. That's a Homburg hat. And it might include the Ford Indigo. This was they never produced the Ford Indigo, but they designed it. They did all the necessary engineering calculations to create an artifact, but they never created any Ford Indigos off the production line. Um, and this is what the news item says. Um, so is it a universal? Because for Aristotle, at least in a crude reading, every universal has to have at least one instance. The problem is that there are universals which don't have any instances, like the Ford Indigo, like certain chemical molecules that people have been trying to synthesize, but which are in fact unsynthesizable. In other words, you can't make those molecules, but you can write down their chemical structure. So do those the corresponding universals exist? We think that we have a way of understanding that. And it was set forth, well, actually, the basis of it rests upon this paper. This paper makes the claim that ontologies are like scientific theories. And scientific theories, as we know, sometimes get things wrong, and then we just correct them. We delete them from the record. Nobody reads papers about phlogiston anymore because we now know that phlogiston doesn't exist. So what happens? When we're doing chemical synthesis on a certain family of molecules, we give the corresponding molecule types names. We then later discover that there will never be instances of those molecule types, and so we delete those names from our ontology because ontologists make mistakes. It's no big deal. We can play play risky or play tentative with our new molecules in the hope that we will one day synthesize them. They may stay in the list forever because we never know. We never find out that they can't be synthesized. But once we do find out that they can never exist, then we delete them from the ontology. The Higgs boson will stay forever because it's been shown to exist. All right, I think that's probably a good place to stop. You can work out the implications for Dodo in your to your heart's content. But now I guess we have time for questions. If there's still anyone there.
Hey, Barry,
Yeah.
can you go back to a slide? You just had it up. It was universals having at least one instance.
Yeah. Made a mistake there, didn't I? Here we are. This one?
Yeah, 58. Um, can you think of an example that goes against this? So we have a universal that we're all designing in our we're collectively designing some new thing. And it doesn't have insane engineering and it doesn't have an instance yet.
So the example would be the Ford Indigo.
Yeah. Okay.
When we talk about the Ford Indigo now, suggesting that it is a universal like the Ford Pinto, if there am I right? Is it Ford Pinto?
Yeah.
So if we talk about it in the same tone of voice that we talk about the Ford Pinto, we're making a mistake. We talk about it as a kind of joke. And we would never put it in our list of Ford production vehicles, neither would Ford.
Yeah.
There's a photograph, or anyway, maybe
Yeah.
a photograph.
Okay, one more. I have one more question that's been, and you and I have discussed this probably way back when we're talking about generically dependent continuants, and we're talking about the bearers of those things.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a series of raised bumps on a piece of paper.
Yes.
The Braille system,
Yeah.
right? So that one line of raised bumps uh makes an assertion or prescribes something or whatever it's
Yeah.
saying, whatever it's about. In
Okay.
my mind, the raised bumps are the information bearing entity, not the page that they're
Okay.
on.
I agree, but you've opened up a problem which BFO needs to address. And I have addressed it in several places. And it goes like this. So we have in BFO the term object aggregate. And an object aggregate is something like a population or a deck of cards or a box of chocolates where
Yep.
we know exactly what the parts are and they're all objects. And so my lung is not a part of the object aggregate, which is professors at UB. I am, but my lung is not. So the part relation is not transitive for object aggregates. Now, what I say when the object aggregate term is used in the documentation is users of BFO should feel free to coin new aggregate terms. So you might have a quality aggregate, which is the colors currently offered by Bausch and Lomb or whichever company makes paint on their color sheets. That would be a quality aggregate, I suppose. Or you might have a language aggregate. So there can be quality aggregates, there can be process aggregates, there can be object aggregates, there can be fiat object part aggregates. But the pile of bumps on the page, on the Braille page, is an example of a bump aggregate.
Yeah. Okay.
And actually, it's a little bit more than that. It's not just an aggregate because the relative spatial locations of the bumps are important. Bumps for Braille is incidentally no different ontologically from tiny patterned piles of ink in a printed text or in a written text where you're using ink. And so one of the ways in which we might deal with linguistically expressed information is in terms of ink pile aggregates.
Yeah.
But we can't because now, damn it, we have also pixel aggregates.
Yeah. Yeah.
And pixel aggregates behave very differently from an ontological point of view from the way in which piles of ink or bumps behave. As you can see, we are in many ways faithful to the sort of approach to ontology that is common in biology when people talk about the tree of life. So this is a very simple and completely erroneous snapshot of a little bit of the tree of life. And I'll say one or two things about these examples. So first of all, the species cat is a subspecies of the species mammal. The species Siamese cat is a subspecies of the species cat, but there almost certainly is not a real species there. Rather, it is what we might call a fiat species. So it's been created by human beings through unnatural but policies of reproduction on the part of certain selected cats to create a putative subspecies. And what this means is that when we're building our counterpart of ontologies like this, we're going to have to deal with two kinds of species, or two kinds of kind, or two kinds of type, or universal. And all of those words, species, kind, type, universal, they're all pretty much synonymous. Now, cat, mammal, animal, and organism are all natural kinds. But Siamese cat is a created kind. It's not a natural kind in the sense in which people normally use that term. Similarly, if we were building an ontology of devices, then a car would be a created kind, and a Ford Pinto car would be a sub-kind of that created kind. But then vehicle, it begins to be questionable whether we classify vehicle as a created kind or as a natural kind. But certainly when we reach the point where we're dealing with useful object or device, it gets tempting to say that that is a natural kind. And a car is then a sub-kind of the useful object kind. And where we draw the line between natural kinds and created kinds is not really a very important question, because they're all kinds. And from the very beginning, BFO has said that when we're dealing with kinds or universals or whatever we call them, we're going to be dealing both with natural kinds, such as mammal and so forth, and with created kinds, such as bottle of peanut butter or blackboard or leash for a cat and so on, or for a dog. So I've made that point there, that we are trying to do justice to the fact that there are different kinds of kind, or universal, but we're not going to rule out even very, very specific kinds which are created for very specific purposes, because they too will fall within a hierarchy like this one. And now what's characteristic of this hierarchy is the principle of single inheritance. Every term in this hierarchy, or every node in the hierarchy, has at most one parent. The topmost node, which here is object, has 0 parents, but no term in this hierarchy has 2 parents. And that's true of all the hierarchies that we build. So there are some problem cases which we may deal with in due course, but in general, that there is always a reason where you have 2 possible parent terms for a given single term in a hierarchy like this. There are reasons that you can bring forward to choose one of those 2 alternatives rather than the other. And we'll get to that in a minute. All right. Now, Aristotle thought that there are joints of reality. Actually, that phrase, I think, comes from Plato. The joints of reality, they're reflected in the tree structures that we're talking about here. Now, this tree structure approach breaks down when you get to the low level of bacteria, but it works very well, we claim, for all mesoscopic entities. I believe it will work for macroscopic entities like galaxies too, but we'll have other problems if we start dealing with cosmological topics. For the moment, we will assume that BFO is a common sense ontology, but it has the power to deal also with ontological features of domains like chemistry and biology. We do not claim that BFO can deal, for instance, with quantum physics or with the general theory of relativity. Now, how do we deal with what I was referring to earlier as created kinds, which cause problems for our hierarchical approach? Well, we can think of an example like pet. What is the parent of pet in an ontology? Well, it's going to be animal. But really, pet is not a kind of animal. Rather, it's a disjunction of kinds of animals. A pet is either a dog or a cat or I don't know, fish or a parrot or a rock in some circles. And so the definition of pet is not a definition which uses a single parent. It's a definition which has a list of disjunctive options. And for this reason, it doesn't correspond to any joint of reality. And the same applies to gift or to machine that is located near a window or thing somebody might want for Christmas as a Christmas present. These are not natural kinds because they're not kinds at all. They're what we call defined classes, and defined classes are abbreviations, really. They are mechanisms for dealing with certain kinds of data where there are no natural kinds to be had, but where we can define something which looks like a definition of a natural kind, but which is not a definition of anything. It's just a tool for talking about certain things. It's a useful abbreviation for talking about certain things, and even for using the terms that like pet or gift in an ontology. There's no objection to doing that. However, as soon as you do start to do that, you will find that you break the rule of single inheritance. And so what that means is that really there are two kinds of ontologies. There are ontologies which include only those terms which represent true kinds, including created kinds. And then there are those ontologies which also include defined classes. The former satisfy the rule of principal inheritance. The latter do not satisfy the rule of principal inheritance. And so they look much more like spaghetti than they look like a clear hierarchical tree in the mathematical sense, which means a hierarchy which satisfies the rule of single inheritance. Now, if you look at Protégé, which is the main tool for editing ontologies, you will find that there is a feature which allows you to show an ontology with or without the defined classes. So the feature goes under the heading asserted classes versus inferred classes. And what this means is that if you use the asserted class button, then you only get the terms which are in the tree, which is a real tree because it satisfies single inheritance. And to say that it was asserted means that the authors of the ontology were confident that each of those terms refers to a kind. But now, once you have defined classes, you also have definitions for those classes. For instance, pet is defined as dog or cat or and such used by for comfort and play and so forth. That definition can be added to the definitions in your asserted ontology, and then Protégé will show also defined classes, the inferred classes, as it calls them, and then the visualization of that ontology will become, again, much more like spaghetti than the nice, well-behaved tree that you had in the asserted version of the ontology. All right, now there is a very useful rule which can help you in deciding whether to include a term in your ontology to refer to a universal or a kind or a type. Again, all of these words I'm using synonymously. Now, so how do we deal with a word like child? Should we include in our ontology of organisms a term child? The answer is that we should not. And the reason is, and this reason goes back to Aristotle also, every universal must satisfy this rule, namely, if something is an instance of that universal at some time, then if that thing ceases to be an instance of that universal in a later time, it ceases to exist, then it's not going to go into your, then it ceases to exist, then it can go into your ontology. So I'll say that again in a different term. So child doesn't go into your ontology because something X can cease to be a child without ceasing to exist. Dog can go into your ontology because if a dog ceases to be a dog, then it ceases to exist. If a human ceases to be a human, then a human ceases to exist. If a machine ceases to be a machine, then a machine ceases to exist, and so on. So devices are universals, or any device terms represent universals. Organism terms represent universals, but terms which have built into them temporal constraints, like 4-year-old or child, or maybe unfashionable. So an unfashionable video does not cease to exist if it ceases to be unfashionable. So are you getting the idea? The key to being a universal is that the instances, if they cease to be instances of that universal, cease to exist. So if anyone wants to ask me to go over that again, I will happily do so. It sounds more difficult than it is. Eventually, it becomes second nature. All right, now it's another principle of realism. Again, this comes from Aristotle. All ontology classes have or had or prospectively will have instances. And this is a very interesting principle. There is a literature on Aristotle's views of what he called universals, to the effect that he didn't really think in every case that a universal had to have an instance. But he does say that at various points. And so the problem with Aristotle is that we don't have any extant work written by Aristotle. We only have lecture notes by his students, and those lecture notes often give vague or conflicting accounts of what Aristotle believed. This is somewhat more carefully formulated than Aristotle would have formulated it. So Aristotle believed that all species are eternal. Again, leaving aside one or two places where he believes something slightly different. So there couldn't be a species like dodo which would go out of existence because it becomes extinct. That's impossible for Aristotle. But we know that species can become extinct. We want species, and by species I mean species of organisms, to be good ontology nodes. So they are to be such that our ontologies will contain terms representing species, but we know that species can go extinct because of the dodo. And so we don't say all ontology classes have instances. We say that they either have or they had instances at some point in time. But now, what about those classes which will have instances? Now, here there are some interesting examples. So let's suppose that you work for the Ford Motor Company and you've been spending 13 years designing a new car, and the type of the car, let's say it's the Ford Pinto, will one day have thousands and thousands of instances. But at the moment, even though you and your colleagues in the design and prototyping shops have been talking about instances of the Ford Pinto for years, no actual instance exists. And so what do we do? Well, we haven't published this yet, but we are working on the following solution, namely that where we have good reason to think that instances will exist, or even where we have good reason to think that instances might exist, then we are allowed to add terms into our ontology referring to a corresponding type. So the people working in the Ford design shop could add Ford Pinto to their ontology of Ford car types for as long as there is a prospect, an expectation that instances of that type will exist. And now the same might be true if you're working in a chemistry lab. You have a molecule structure, which you have on paper. You can study this structure. You're confident that it will be possible to synthesize molecules having this structure. And so while you're working on this, on those synthesizing projects, you use a name for this molecule in your ontology. And that's fine because there is a prospect that you will be able to create instances of that molecule. But now let's suppose that down the road, you discover that it's actually impossible to synthesize molecules like that because of some quantum chemical feature of the atoms or for some reason like that. Then you would immediately delete that term that you had included in your ontology because you realize that you made a mistake. Now, this is an important lesson for ontological activities. So when we started building ontologies in biology, that we were often attacked. People said, oh, you can't use an ontology because an ontology gives you a fixed repertoire of kinds of entities, and that fixed repertoire will be out of date within a few months because at that time biology was advancing so quickly. So they said, you should stop building ontologies. And they were wrong. So ontologies proved and still prove to be amazingly useful tools for doing biological and even more importantly, biomedical research. So, but there was a grain of truth in what they were saying. So the ontologies that we were building, they did not really think very hard about the question raised by the plans, the industrial designs, the unsynthesized chemicals that I just referred to. As soon as we had, or as soon as the biologists had an inkling that there was a certain kind of entity, they would add it to the ontology. But then later on, they may discover that they made a mistake and they should actually have added 4 separate things. For instance, 4 different kinds of diabetes. I think it's now 5. Because there is no such thing as diabetes simpliciter. There are only diabetes type 1, diabetes type 2, and so on. So changes like that were being made all the time, but they didn't, I was present, I too did not really think about the nature of this activity of adding new terms and deleting terms from ontologies. Now, I actually did quite early on, and you see that this issue now raised its ugly head once again in connection with the Higgs boson. So there is a very beautiful ontology of bosons, and it was built before they could prove that the Higgs boson existed, which included the Higgs boson. It really is a very pretty symmetrical ontology. The Higgs boson was then proved to exist, but it could have been that they discovered that the Higgs boson didn't exist, and then that beautiful ontology would have to be replaced because it wouldn't be beautiful anymore. It would have a big hole in the middle. So what did I say? Well, in a paper called Ontology brackets science close brackets. So in other words, ontology as a science, I said that we should actually embrace the view that an ontology is itself comparable to a scientific theory. And everybody who knows anything about the philosophy of science knows that all science is fallible. There is no scientific truth which is not known to, on a priori grounds to be absolutely, universally, eternally, objectively, unrepudiatably true. So this is an idea which was popularized by Popper. All empirical scientific propositions are fallible. And now if we recognize that, then there's no problem about adding terms into an ontology, provided you have a good reason to think that instances of that term might exist, or perhaps already do exist, maybe 4 miles under the earth or something like that. You can add terms to your ontology, but you can also face a need to delete terms from your ontology. And that's what the gene ontology, for instance, has been doing systematically for 27 years, because an ontology is like a scientific theory. Okay. Now, so we have ontology classes. They reflect corresponding joints of reality. There are joints of reality which are captured already in the realm of created universals or creative kinds, such as the joint, that is to say, the objective discontinuity between the Ford Pinto and the Ford Mustang, and between the Ford Mustang and the Ford Shelby, and so on. And then the third point here, or number 5 on the list, is that joints of reality reflect genuine hierarchies, which is to say tree structures all the way down. Although, as I said already, once we get down to the level of bacteria, then we have problems because bacteria do not obey the tree single inheritance axioms. All right. And now I have a footnote here. Actually, this should go with number 4. I have the asterisk in 2 places. So this is the asterisk under 4. I say cutting up any body is difficult, but it is a process made relatively easier if one incises at the joints. Now we are cutting up the world in a way, so we're looking for joints in reality. It's really hard to find joints in reality forming a tree structure in bacteria, but you can do it even for joints inside a cow or a pig. So when a butcher cuts up a cow, then there are various joints that the butcher will follow. And these are parts of reality because they're parts of the cow. Once the cow has been butchered, they become objects in the BFO sense. Before the cow has been butchered, they are fiat object parts, and they do not have any boundaries, which are joints of reality, separating them from the other parts of the cow. Now, we're going to find this kind of joints of reality problem all over the place. For instance, when we're dealing with machines which have, or with cars, let's say, there are many parts of the car which are welded to other parts of the car. So there are no joints of reality separating them. But when you look at the diagrams of car parts, you will see that they have given specific names, and there are boundaries which are drawn in, maybe in dotted lines on the picture of what the car is made of. The same goes to the brain. The brain has regions, and those regions are very important to understanding the functions of different parts of the brain. But the regions do not have bona fide boundaries between each other. They only have fiat boundaries. Fiat meaning those boundaries are drawn by the scientist on the basis of what she or he learns to be structures in the brain which have different functions. All right, now I've lost my numbering system here, but if you're going to do successful ontology, then you should adopt the hub and spokes approach. And we've been doing this again since the the original foundation of BFO. So of course, BFO is the right hub. If you have to choose a hub, then you use BFO. BFO was not the first ontology hub, but it was the first really successful ontology hub. And there is one successful collection of ontologies, which is based in Toronto, whose members are now reconfiguring their ontologies to be conformant with BFO because they realized that they failed to follow the hub and spokes rule when they were building their ontologies. It really does make a lot of things easier, which we will discover as we go along. Now, the next rule is a traffic law, which people sometimes break. So actually, the correct statement of this rule is that all terms in an ontology should be either singular nouns or singular noun phrases. The phrase singular noun phrase is a singular noun phrase. The phrase all terms is not a singular noun phrase because it's in the plural. So I assume that you get this idea. If you look at the gene ontology, it's full of really long singular noun phrases. There are no sentences in the ontology hierarchy of the gene ontology, even though the gene ontology deals with very complicated facts of the matter in biology. Then the reason why this rule is a good rule, even it's a traffic law, that all that means is that it's easy to follow. But lots of people, when they start building ontologies, forget this rule. And so if you're marking the work, then they get low marks because they did not follow this very simple traffic rule. It's equivalent to driving on the wrong side of the road, which many people do, of course. So the reason why we have this rule is because each ontology term represents exactly one universal. And this universal might be organism, it might be headache, it might be drug administration, which means giving somebody a drug. These are all universals. Organism is an independent continuant universal, headache is a dependent continuant universal, and drug administration is an occurrent universal. All right. Now, the Summa, which is a competitor to BFO in the top level ontology business, does not follow this rule. It doesn't follow the single inheritance rule either. It turns out, if you look at qualities here, it turns out that to capture qualities of processes is very hard. And we've been working now for 23 years to find a suitable way of teaching people how to represent what we call characteristics of processes. For those 22, 23 years, I assumed that we wouldn't need to have the counterpart of qualities of processes. But now I realize that we do need what we call characteristics of processes. But we can talk about that on another occasion. So this is not merely breaking rules, it contains peculiar statements. The examples are at the bottom. So it says numeric is a base ontology. That's just nonsense. It's also an ontology mistake that is very often made. So in the very first version of the gene ontology, it contained the axiom cell is a gene ontology. And that's wrong. A cell is not an ontology. And similarly, qualities is not a processes, which is what that says if you look at it. Although the arrow goes in both directions, which is also confusing. Since a processes is never a qualities and an objects is never a qualities. But here I'm assuming, of course, that the arrow means is-a, which it can't mean. But then the question is, what does it mean? And all right, so I've used some of the terms here. I'm assuming that by now, the terms at the very top of BFO, I'm assuming that you understand these terms, that you're familiar with them. I'll give you 10 seconds to read this, and then I will move on. All right. So you are a substance. That means you are an object. Your life is a process. You exist in 3 dimensions. Your life exists in 4 dimensions. And we have this relation specifically depends on between, for instance, a headache and a head, or a headache and an organism, and then, or a temperature and the bearer of the temperature. All of these are examples of the relation specifically depends on. At the bottom here, we have pretty representations of the instances. So there are instances of the universal thing, such as me. There are instances of the universal quality, such as my shoddy timekeeping when it comes to meetings like this. And then there are instances in the realm of occurrence. So that temperature depends on bearer. It points to this red arrow here. It doesn't point upwards. So instances of process would be your temperature changing over time, or you running in a race, or the planet circling on its axis. And then, so the problem is that we have to deal with 2 kinds of dependence. Many relations in ontology land come in 2 flavors. On the one hand, you have the instance level flavor, which says that John is specifically dependent upon his heart, let's say. It's not a very good example, but it would do. John can't exist without his heart. It's not quite true, because we could have a heart transplant. So John can't exist without his brain. That'll do for the moment. So John is necessarily such that if his brain ceases to exist, then John ceases to exist. Now, on the type level, that would say a human cannot exist unless some brain exists. So that means human is dependent upon brain. In fact, it's dependent on human brain. This is an example of specific dependence on the type level, as opposed to specific dependence on the instance level. And now it looks as if they're pretty much the same, but in fact, there's a crucial difference between these 2. Let me see if it's on the next slide. So I'll give you an example of this crucial difference, which we may meet again down the road. So on the instance level, specific dependence is, let me just get this right, first of all. Now, I will ensure that I get it right by changing the example. On the instance level, all relations, on the instance level, some relations are symmetric. So an example would be, is adjacent to. So your lungs are adjacent to your heart. I'm assuming that that's true. I know nothing except ontology. I don't know anything about real things. So your lung is adjacent to your heart means that your heart is adjacent to your lung, because adjacency is symmetric. But on the type level, adjacency is not symmetric. And now I'll make up another example. So the uterus, the pelvis is adjacent to the uterus. That means that every pelvis is adjacent to some uterus. Again, just trust me that the biology at least illustrates the point, even if it's false biologically. That's true, but it's not true that every pelvis is adjacent to some uterus, because males have a pelvis, but they don't have a uterus. Now, another example would be coincides temporally with, so is coincident with. So in some factory, the coffee break is coincident with the smoking break. And if that's true in John Taylor's factory, then it follows that the smoking break is adjacent to the coffee break because that's what we mean by, sorry, coincident to the coffee break because that's what we mean by is coincident with or simultaneous with. But in another factory, they have 10 smoking breaks during the day, and only two of them are coffee breaks. So the coffee break is always coincident with some smoking break, but there are many smoking breaks which are not coincident with any coffee break. So you see that there is a crucial logical difference between specific dependence on the instance level and specific dependence on the type level. Now, the discovery of this, or anyway, the first published presentation of this idea was, which I was the first author on this publication because I think I was the first person to see it through clearly. This paper it was a big deal in biomedical ontology, so it changed the way people like the gene ontology thought about relations. It was really very influential. The sad part of this story is that there was a quite big mistake in the paper, which is a big mistake, but it's not an important mistake because except in very special circumstances, it doesn't make a difference. And I can explain what the mistake is if people are interested in the discussion. But it took 20 years or 21 years to find a solution to that mistake. And we still haven't well, yes, we have published the solution now, but no one likes the solution. It's really horrible. The solution was due to Alan Ruttenberg. Some of you will know that name. All right, so let's keep moving on. So there are three types of SDCs, I will say: qualities, roles, and dispositions. These are the three types which are distinguished by BFO. These are still the only three types which are distinguished by BFO, although we have been working on some subtypes, which are I will talk about later on if people are interested. So qualities are what we call inert. That is to say, if something has a quality, then it just has that quality. So a sheet of white paper is white even if you switch off all the lights. Now, roles and dispositions are not inert. Sometimes I say that they are inert, but no one likes that. I would like to know what is the negation of inert, but anyway. So roles and dispositions are not always manifested or realized or executed, or they're not always presenting themselves. So I am at the moment lecturing, but when I've done, then I will not be lecturing, but it's still my role to be a lecturer. And this machine on my desk is giving rise to unusual smells. So it didn't do that yesterday and it won't do that tomorrow, but I learned that it does it occasionally, which means that it has this disposition. So a disposition is realized maybe often, maybe never. So some entities have dispositions, but they never realize them because they die before. So you may have a heart which has a disposition to illness when you reach the age of 70, but you never reach the age of 70 because you die of something else first. So dispositions are potentials or tendencies, real physical possibilities is the official definition of entities which may or may not be realized. And that's not part of the definition because it adds nothing logically to the definitions, because to be either realized or not realized is true of everything. I'm not realized because I'm not a process. Sorry, I'm not a disposition. All right, now, so roles similarly are sometimes not realized. So I may have the role of a lawyer. I have a sheet of paper which testifies that I am a lawyer, and it's been assigned to me, this role, by the official board or But I've never practiced as a lecturer. I've not realized as a lawyer, my lawyer role has remained unrealized. Maybe it remains unrealized forever because I never choose to practice law, but I still have the role. So roles and dispositions have a quite different features from qualities. And now what differentiates roles from dispositions is that dispositions are real physical possibilities. So they are a matter of the physics of the bearer, where roles are a matter of something like social ascription. So that a role is assigned, or a role is the equivalent of being assigned. So if you get to be first in a queue only because you got there before anyone else, then you still have the role of being first in the queue, even though that role was not assigned by anybody. So that's why I say not roles are assigned, but I say people have roles because they are assigned or through some practice or policy which is equivalent to being assigned. And so you get the idea. I think I've given enough examples of all of these things. Now, what we say is that continuants have qualities like height, weight, temperature, color, shape, and so on. And now continuants can gain and lose these qualities. So your height can change. You can't lose your height. You always have some height. You can't lose your temperature. You can't lose your color. You can't lose your shape. But you could lose your headache. You could lose your suntan. You could lose your ability to box. But actually, that's not a quality. That's a disposition. So stick with qualities for the moment. There are some qualities which you always have, some qualities which you can gain and lose. You could gain qualities like, anyway, I've given you examples. And now it's important that because objects can gain and lose qualities, then we need extra entities in the universe called qualities, which would have instances of your own. Your headache, your height, your weight. These are all instances of quality universals. Now, occurrence cannot gain and lose their counterpart of qualities. And that is why for 22 years, we never included in BFO the counterpart of qualities for occurrence or processes. And it sounds mad now because it's obvious that we can say lots of things about occurrence which are true, but we never needed an extra entity. And that's why BFO did not even pay lip service to the need for qualities of processes, because processes do not change. And this is a John Beverly slide now, as you can see, because of the pretty font that he uses. Now, so we understand change as being gain or loss of specifically dependent continuants, getting hotter, getting hungry, and so on. And now in BFO, occurrence do not bear these SDCs, and so they can't gain or lose them. So they can't change. So the process of your temperature rising in a certain hour, it was a process of going from 33 degrees to 34 degrees, let's suppose. But it can't gain or lose that quality, because if it had gone from 34 to 35 degrees or from 34 to 32 degrees, A, you would be ill, but B, they would be different processes. They wouldn't be the same processes. The key is that you can remain the same person and gain or lose a quality, and you have thereby changed in quality but remain the same as a human being. A process cannot gain or lose a quality in that sense, but remain the same process. So it could be that you were never born. Oh, well, no, I won't go down that road. That would be too complicated. And anyway, you wouldn't be here to hear what I say. All right, processes are changes. So in that sense, you can't have changes in processes. Processes cannot change because they are changes. And that means that we can't understand these things, increasing velocity of a vehicle, in terms of properties of processes. Again, processes are changes. They are but now there could be something like a quality of this increasing velocity of this vehicle, this process, namely that it was causing horrendous fear in the part of the three people on the middle of the road in front of this vehicle just as it started to increase its velocity. In other words, this increasing velocity of this vehicle at this time on this road with these people on the road was a very frightening process. That's something like a quality of this process. And so that's what we need to account for. And now this is changing color. And it doesn't, this is a John Beverly diagram. What the diagram is designed to show is that when a process changes, it's the participants which change, not the process. Processes cannot change. Now, tied to the three people standing in front of an accelerating vehicle example, what we would say is that the relevant process here is not just the car as participant, it has also those three people as participant. And then the dangerousness is indeed part of the process. It's not something extra which gets added to the process and which might not have been there. All right, so this is just more John Beverly explaining how it's the participants in processes which change. So if the flower starts to wither, then it's the flower which changes, not the process of its ripening or whatever the withering process is understood in terms of. All right, so processes that do not change. Therefore, there is no extra entity comparable to quality, but we already saw with the example of the three people in front of the car that we can have a great need to assign quality-like entities to processes, being dangerous, being annoying, being exciting, being explosive, being unavoidable, being interrupted, being repeated. These are all perfectly good adjectives that we can assign to processes. And so we added the term process to BFO. That was, I mean, we added it. We haven't published anything, or apart from one or two small contributions which are coming out just at the moment, we haven't documented this new red item within the BFO ontology. It will be in the BFO ontology officially very soon. But now, one of the reasons why we haven't added it boldly and effectively as we should have done is because we have the feeling, or I have the feeling, that characteristics are not real entities. That characteristic classes in BFO are in fact defined classes like pet. And so if we can define every characteristic following something like this process, which is the kind of process that, following something like this template, which is the kind of template that John Beverly is very talented in producing, then we wouldn't need to add characteristic as an extra term in BFO. Rather, we could add characteristic as a defined class, which users of BFO are welcome to use, just as owners of pet animals are welcome to use the defined class called pet. All right, so these are the examples. All of these are characteristics of processes. Are they representing real entities in the world in addition to the corresponding processes? Well, if we take the dangerousness case with the accelerating car, as we saw, by making the process have the three innocent human beings as participants, we would have then some features of the process which were intrinsic features rather than additional features. But whether that would justify saying that the dangerousness here is a defined class, we just haven't worked it out yet. These kinds of questions take a lot of thinking, and it's amazing how complicated a small ontology like BFO with only 35 classes can be, as we know after 23 years of trying to meet all objections. All right, so this is the view that was being held when I created these slides. We're still discussing whether characteristics should be bona fide extra entities. This is I'm just repeating now that maybe they are defined classes, and now we can see whether they satisfy the no sudden death criterion, which we mentioned before. So let's suppose that we want characteristic to be a universal. So let's take the dangerousness of the process of me accelerating my car when there were three people standing in front of the car in the middle of the road. So I'm confessing now to my bad driving habits. So is this an instance of a universal called dangerousness of a process? It should, if so, it should be true that if X, namely Smith's driving or the car moving, the car accelerating at this particular interval of time at t, and it ceases to be dangerous at t prime, then does it cease to exist at t prime? And now you see we have two options. So nothing is easy in this world. In one option, if we take the universal to be such that the three innocent targets of my driving are participants in the process, then if we get rid of them, in other words, if they intelligently walk to one side of the road so that I can get by, then the process of me accelerating does not cease to exist. The dangerousness does not cease to exist. And so it is a real process. Did I get that right? So all universals use. So dangerousness of a driving has to be such that if this driving is an instance of dangerousness at t, then this process ceases to be an instance of dangerous process at t prime. Now, it did cease to be an instance of dangerousness at t prime because three of the participants in the process moved out of the way. So this suggests that, at least according to this criterion of genuineness of a universal, dangerousness is a characteristic which could count as a universal, not just in BFO's terms, but in Aristotle's terms. And with that, I'm going to declare the end